My name is Michael Otts. I am from the UK, although my surname is not from the UK. My surname Otts comes from Estonia. That's where my father's side of the family come from. But I was born and brought up in the UK. I work primarily with students in university work around Europe and branching out from Europe into Eurasia and come September into Siberia as well with Alexei here. I got into that, I was going to say by accident. I don't believe it was by accident. I believe it was the Lord. But it wasn't necessarily my primary intention to end up in student missions. I was basically an evangelist working for a church 15 years ago. And I got invited to go and speak at a university event, firstly in the UK. I obviously didn't do a very terrible job because I got invited to go back the next year to do it again. And then over the course of the next 4 years, I got invited to do increasing amounts of student evangelism in the UK. And I was doing so much after 5 years that the church that was employing me at the time said that they weren't going to employ me anymore because I was never there. And so maybe they should send me out as a missionary to work primarily in a student context. And so that's still my home church, but I'm not on the staff there. But I'm on the associate regional team of IFES Europe, and I'm involved in supporting Christian student groups around Europe. And I'm particularly speaking at week-long mission events that have been taking place historically a lot in the UK over many years, and then increasingly over the last 10 years in other parts of Europe as well. I'm part of a network of evangelists in Europe called the FOCLID network, which stands for the Fellowship of Evangelists in the Universities of Europe. It's a bit of a dodgy acronym because you have to borrow the E and the R from Europe. But that spells the German word for fire. So it was started by an Englishman, an English speaker and a German speaker, which is why they called it that. And that's been a very exciting initiative that's grown this across Europe. And some of the stories that you'll be hearing from today will be stories that have been instigated or inspired by that network. It's great having you all here. As I said, lots of the ideas that I'm going to share have really come out of this four-year network. And a lot of what I'm doing is speaking specifically into week-long evangelistic outreaches that we've been initiating in various parts of Europe over the last 10 years. So a lot of the lessons that come out of that are applied from that kind of experience. As I say, hopefully there's application into other contexts too. So our conviction is not that a mission week as such is a biblical concept, but the proclamation of the of the gospel, the evangelistic proclamation of the gospel in the public sphere is something which we think is a biblical principle and it's important. Now it says 10 lessons because that's what I said about 6 months ago before I actually prepared the seminar. Then when I prepared the seminar, I came up with 13 lessons. And so I thought, the trouble is 13 doesn't sound quite as good as 10. So then I thought, well, can I ditch one of them to make it 12? Because at least that's like a biblical number rather than 13, which just sounds bad. But then I thought, no, I'll just stick to 13. So that's actually a lie. So just, if you get to 10 and think we're finished, there's 3 more to go after that. Some of these are quite practical. Some of these you might think are somewhat obvious. Some of these might be perhaps surprising. But we'll go through. Some of them I'll say more on than others. The first lesson I think that we've learned across Europe over the last few years is this, that we're never too small to do something. 10 years ago, as I said, mission weeks didn't really happen in many countries in Europe. They happened in the UK. And when we shared the idea with some people, the idea was, of course, well, we're not big enough to do something like that. We're not big enough to really have an impact in our university. There's only a few of us in our student group. But one of the things I think that we've been really encouraged by over the last 10 years is seeing sometimes very small groups doing things that are disproportionately big and realizing that actually our size doesn't have to be an obstacle to growth. And we've worked in some countries that are very small in terms of their evangelical number. Montenegro, I think statistically, is the smallest evangelical church in Europe at the moment. Nationally, I think there's about 100, 120 evangelical believers in Montenegro. The student group had 2 students involved in it. But we worked with that group and in that university in the town of Nikšić. And we got about 100 to 120 coming along each night, which we thought was pretty amazing for an evangelistic event, to have the same number of people coming as there were evangelical believers in the country. It was a massive impact in terms of the proportionate size of the country. We had a series of lectures. in the university. They billed it as having a kind of Western speaker coming to present about his book. That was me. And they managed to get it advertised within the university. We did another in Serbia in a student group. This was the mission that was going on there. They often use cafes and coffee shops in the Balkans for evangelistic events. And we had a great week, good number of people coming along, good buzz, lots of interest. The amazing thing about this particular mission, it was organised by a student group of one. There was literally one Christian student in that town, in that university. But they had seen stuff going on in other towns, and they were desperate to try and do something. And so they invited myself to come and speak, some others to come and help, and they managed to do something of significance, which is just an encouraging reminder, isn't it, that we're never too small to be able to do something. And the problem is not normally size. The problem is normally a lack of enthusiasm or a lack of vision. Where you have just one or two with a vision to have an impact, you can see things happen. But I think it's also worth saying that evangelism is difficult everywhere. Often when I go to a particular country, I say, what are the particular challenges? What are the particular issues that you have in evangelism in this country? And there's a danger to think it's more difficult in my country than everywhere else. And what I've realized is that actually it is challenging anywhere in Europe, but just for different reasons. And so, of course, in Northern Europe, the challenge of secularism in the predominantly Protestant countries is a big challenge to overcome. In Southern Europe, the history of Catholicism and the kind of suspicion of evangelicalism is a barrier sometimes to overcome in those places, as it is to an extent in Eastern Europe, isn't it? With the challenges of people's perceptions of evangelical Christianity when they come from an Orthodox background. And so we can be tempted to think it is more difficult for us, but in a sense it is challenging everywhere. But, this is kind of linked, the wonderful thing is, although the evangelism is difficult everywhere, the gospel works everywhere as well, because it is true and it is powerful. And so it's been wonderful to see evangelistic initiatives taking root in very different cultural contexts across Europe. In the Protestant north, the Catholic south, the Orthodox east, even in nominally Muslim Albania, and to see how evangelistic initiatives have been very impactful, and to see people coming to faith in all of those contexts. And to see sometimes some significantly large events going on, where it's not uncommon to have at least 50% or more of the audience being not just non-Christian, but completely, we might say, pagan, people who have never had any experience of Christianity, never been to a church before, or anything like that. So it is encouraging that even though there are challenges, we're seeing people coming to faith. The next lesson I'd say is that prayerfulness leads to fruitfulness. God answers prayer, and he often makes us the answer to our prayers as well. I've done, I think, over the last 10 years or more, around about 100 to 150 missions. I wish I kept count, but I didn't. But I've done a lot of missions. Some of them have been very effective and fruitful, and we've seen people come to faith. Some of them have been a lot more challenging. Some of them, frankly, weren't very good. We're not always good at reporting the bad stories, are we? We always report the positive stories when it comes to mission. But what I'd say is there's been a direct correlation between the prayerfulness of the local students, the Christian students, an organisation, and the effectiveness of the mission. Almost always. You can see a correlation there, which shouldn't surprise us, should it? Because the Lord does answer prayer. And when we're reliant upon the Lord and we expect great things of him, often he does not only what we ask, but more than we ask and imagine, according to Ephesians 3. So it's wonderful to see that. I mean, this was a mission week in one university. This was the prayer meeting in the morning, where the entire student group, about 80 to 100 students, came every morning, 7:30 in the morning. I always laugh when people say students can't wake up in the morning. I say, well, Christian students can when it comes to mission. And meeting for an hour. Breakfast was also an incentive at the end. But to really commit that whole week to prayer and to the Lord. And we've often seen a link in that way. And so when I'm mobilizing a group for mission, the number one thing that I would say is important to stress is the value of prayer. Because if you can get people praying, the other stuff kind of flows out of it. If you can't get people praying, then all of the other stuff, it just becomes an extra challenge. And in a week of evangelistic initiative, if you can get people out in the morning to pray, they're far more likely to get involved in the other events, far more likely to invite their friends and so on. And I also say to students, look, it's really difficult to pray specifically, consistently, by name for your non-Christian friends for 6 months and then forget to invite them to an evangelistic event. So if we can get people praying specifically, corporately, creatively, persistently, then we find that the Lord often answers. Another thing that we've discovered is that motivation ultimately comes from a passion for Jesus. And so what we're really wanting to instill in the life of Christian students is not just a passion for this activity called a mission week, or even for an activity called evangelism, but we want to really instill is a passion for the gospel, a passion for Jesus. And where you see students that have got a passion for Jesus, then everything kind of flows out of that. And that can be channeled in terms of all sorts of directions. Where you don't have that passion and enthusiasm, it's actually a bit like pushing a lorry up a hill with the brakes on, isn't it, when you're trying to get people involved in doing mission and evangelism. So what I've noticed again is that the places where we've seen great, exciting evangelism happen is normally where you've got a core of students who've got a real passion and love for Christ. So this mission week was one a few years ago in the town of Leuven in Belgium. And the interesting thing there was that this mission was very much student-led. A number of students had been to this foyer conference the year before. They'd heard stories about missions from across Europe. They'd been excited by what they'd heard. They'd gone back. They just had such an enthusiasm for the gospel and for mission that they'd organised this mission really off their own back. And I arrived, and it was just a fantastic week. And it was marked by a real passion and enthusiasm amongst those students. And everything flowed out from that. Next lesson is this. Proclamation can be attractive and creative. And I want to say actually not just can, it needs to be. At the heart of the kind of events that we're involved in around Europe is the proclamation of the gospel. It's normally an evangelistic talk from anything from 20 minutes to 45 minutes, normally with a Q&A at the end as well. But what we've discovered is that there's a real difference between how we might do that and how people might respond. So you can, of course, give a talk in a lecture room, sitting in rows, for 45 minutes and respond to questions afterwards, and that's in one sense okay. But we found actually the things that we do in round that, the venue that we use, the environments of that event, the things that we invite them to really make a big difference, both in terms of whether Christians are likely to invite their friends to it in the first place, which is crucial, and secondly, whether their non-Christian friends are likely to come, and thirdly, whether they're likely to come back. So little things are actually quite important. So for instance, venues are quite important. I said this morning in the evangelism track, I hardly ever preach in a church because churches are normally the worst place to do evangelism. So it's always a case of trying to find good venues. Sometimes we've used marquees right in the centre of the university. This was in the north of England. It was freezing cold, but they had heating inside, you'd be glad to know. And that was a creative venue. Sometimes it can be canteens, bars, cafes, restaurants, or whatever, but a warm, creative environment. Little things like the decor of events can make a big difference to how people respond to the events that they're coming to. This was another mission where they just worked really hard, not at great expense, reusable wine bottles, Hessian rugs, pallets, popcorn, that kind of stuff. Not stuff that will break the bank, but creating an environment that people feel welcomed in, that people can relax in. And that's really about communicating something significant to people. We've often found food works very well, as you might expect in student evangelism. If you can feed people, they're more likely to come, particularly if you're inviting people to come out for an evening. It's more of an effort, isn't it, to go back to a place in the evening. And if you can sit around and eat food, number one, students like food because it's free and they are poor, and those two things go very well together. But I also think there's something more than that. When you sit and eat together, you create an environment where it is much easier to share the gospel. Because if you think about it, we have a message, but we also have a medium. And when you have a meal and then give it the talk, the medium fits the message. Because if you think about it, what's one of the most common metaphors of the gospel? or the kingdom of God? Well, it's a feast, isn't it? An invitation to a meal, to a feast. Think of Jesus' words in Revelation, I'll come in and eat with you and you with me. So the whole picture of the gospel through the Bible is this invitation to enjoy fellowship, to enjoy food, to enjoy a feast. And so what better medium in which to communicate the gospel than to invite people to a feast, or at least a nice meal, and then in the context of that meal to be able to share the gospel. And I would have to say, as an evangelist, I can notice it's so much easier to give a talk in this kind of environment where people have just enjoyed a lovely meal together than it is if you were, for instance, sitting in a room like this where we've just kind of wandered in, there's been no food or drinks and everything else. Sorry about the lack of food. We could have done this as a demonstration. I could have cooked you all dinner, but you'll get a nice one later. Other things that are very crucial, I'd say things like music creates obviously an ambience and environment. Not normally loud bands because they become detrimental because it means people can't talk. But jazz, acoustic music, music that creates an environment where people can chat, discuss, and so on. But other things that we often put into the evenings, this is the late Michael Green, we were doing a mission together. He would use testimonies a lot, interviewing people about their journey to faith. Some of you might have met Slavko at previous European leadership forums. He's a former mafia boss. He's got a fascinating story about his journey to faith. And when you put on the advertising, former mafia boss, it certainly intrigues people to come along. And so this was a mission we were doing in Scotland, and the room was absolutely packed. We had about 400 students come. In fact, the people who were running or owned the church said, we're not allowing any more people to come in because we're like over our fire regulations because people are very risk averse when it comes to UK events. So we gave them some food and said, look, if we give you some food, can you let some more people in? And they did. So we ended up with an absolutely packed event, but they came because of the interest in the story. And so there are all sorts of stories sometimes that we use to try and engage interests. Slavko's one of them. More recently, I was interviewing a guy who had been on a kind of prime-time TV show called Gladiators a number of years ago in the UK and talking about his conversion to faith. We had a guy who's head of a large organisation working with people to help them out of poverty, and we interviewed him about his story. We had a guy who was a former terrorist in Northern Ireland and so on. And they will come for the strength of the story more than necessarily the strength of me as an evangelist, because to them, I'm just Michael Otts, I'm nobody. But the story can interest people. And then other things that we've used in that regard, we've used dramatic sketches, to supplement the evangelistic presentation. A 3, 4, 5 minute dramatic sketch that's illustrating something, either raising a question or making a point in the talk. A number of years ago, there was a move where people supplanted evangelistic preaching with drama only, and that was, I think, a bad move. What we want to say is we don't supplant the gospel presentation with these things, but we supplement it. So music, drama, testimony can be used creatively within the presentation of the gospel. Now, a lot of people say people are very bad these days at listening to monologue talks for 45 minutes or whatever. So one of the things we found is that actually, if you can create a magazine format where you have a speaker interspersed with music and drama and testimony, that helps people really engage in what's being said in a way that's more dynamic than if you just have a simple talk with nothing else interspersing it as well. So thinking about creativity in our presentation, thinking about where we're doing our events, thinking about the environment that we create, they all have a massive impact, not only on the effectiveness of the evening, but also normally on the amount of people that come along. Another thing that we've learnt is this, the need for evangelists. This, you might remember, is Michael Green. Michael Green was a good mentor and friend of mine. He went to be with Jesus back in February. And Michael, for many years, had worked in university evangelism, and we had the joy of working together. And one of the things Michael often said is that if you want to organise an effective evangelistic mission, then it makes sense to invite an evangelist to come and speak. And of course, if we were to believe the Bible, we believe that there is a gift to the church called an evangelist that is distinct from the pastor and the teacher. And one of the things we've noticed historically has been sometimes when Christians want to organise an evangelistic outreach, they think, who's the best preacher I know? And they invite a well-known Bible teacher to come and give the talks. Now, I'm not against Bible teachers coming to give talks, and sometimes Bible teachers also have gifts in evangelism, and that can work well. But sometimes it doesn't. And I've been at missions where well-known theologians have been invited to speak, and all the Christians have come along because they like the well-known theologian, but the non-Christians have either not come, or if they have come, they found that it hasn't really connected with them. So one of the things we've been working on over the last 10 years is how can we identify people who may have that gift, how can we nurture that gift, and then how can we release people? And the Foyer Network has been a part of trying to do that in different countries of Europe. And what's been very encouraging is in some parts of Europe now, networks have begun of younger evangelists to develop and nurture them in evangelistic speaking. If you want to know more about them, you can ask at the end. Another thing that we'd want to talk about would be the powerful combination of public and personal evangelism together, and the importance of both. I've often found that talking to churches or to student groups, we naturally emphasize one, sometimes at the expense of the other. So some groups place a great emphasis on the public proclamation of the gospel. We need more preaching. Other groups place a great emphasis on personal evangelism, small group and one-to-one evangelism, and say, well, that's what really works. It's not really preaching that is effective today. But actually, if you look at the book of Acts, you see the model in the book of Acts is that you have both, don't you? You have the public proclamation of the gospel, but alongside it, small group and personal evangelism taking place as well. And what we've discovered is that actually both go hand in hand, and when you have both happening, you have a much more impactful mission event. So one of the things that's grown across Europe over the last 10 years, as well as the growth of public evangelism through things like mission weeks, has also been the growth of what we might call seeker Bible studies. And starting firstly in the UK and then spreading to other countries has been a gospel project called the Uncover Gospel, which you might have heard of in some contexts. It's basically one of the Gospels translated into the local language, presented neatly in a format that would be attractive to students, but then with a series of Bible studies at the back that students can then be equipped to do with their non-Christian friends, either one-to-one or in a small group. And that has really spread like wildfire across Europe, and we've seen groups taking that on board and getting confidence in doing personal evangelism. And when that happens in combination with a public event like a mission week, it's very powerful. Firstly, because I find going into a mission week context, you've already got non-Christians who've been studying the Bible and therefore are far more open to the gospel than people who wouldn't have necessarily thought about it before. But it also means that as you present the gospel, students, Christian students, are much more likely to follow up their friends with a resource that they know and trust. And so recently I was doing a mission week, and at the end of the week, every first-year student, about 30 students, was doing, by the end of the week, an Uncover Bible study with at least one of their non-Christian friends. And it wasn't surprising then as a result that we saw numerous students coming to faith, not just in the week, but in the weeks that followed. Because students were equipped to do that. So we need to think about doing both, not one or the other, but both ends. Another thing we've learned is this, the need for giving people repeated exposure to the gospel and not just one-off events. A survey was done a few years ago by the Billy Graham organization in the States, and it was to ask people how many times they had been exposed to the gospel before they came to faith in Christ. This was for people who came to faith later in life, not for people who had grown up in Christian families. And I think, from memory, the average number was about 32 contacts with the gospel. So that might be a conversation with a Christian friend, or a talk that they heard, a book that they read, that kind of thing. So 32 on average. So that's not to say it has to be 32. Some obviously came to faith much quicker. Some people came to faith more slowly. Now, when I say that, it takes, on average, 32 contacts with the gospel for people to come to faith. There's two reactions we could have. The first reaction is to say, well, it's going to take forever and we probably won't expect it to happen anytime soon. The other way to respond to that is to say, well, if it takes people a lot of exposure, a lot of times to hear the gospel before they come to Christ, how can we create as many opportunities as possible for people to encounter the gospel in a short space of time? And of course, if you only organise one key evangelistic event per year, that's potentially only one event that people will come to per year. But one of the reasons why we often put on a week-long mission event is that we're creating many opportunities for people to hear the gospel in a short space of time. And so some 5-day missions would have both lunchtime and evening talks. And so there's a good chance that some students will come and hear the gospel presented at least 10 times through the week, and then potentially have at least another 5 or more conversations with a Christian friend after the talk, and then probably start reading a gospel or an evangelistic book as well. And so all of that is creating numerous opportunities for people to hear the gospel, which means that very often we see people moving more quickly towards faith than it would take normally. And very often you find students coming at the beginning of the week with very little exposure to the gospel. By the end of the week, they're putting their faith in Christ because they've had so many opportunities to hear the gospel explained, to hear their questions answered, to get to know Christians, to be welcomed into Christian community and so on. It's a very powerful thing to do. So it really does help in terms of people coming to faith. But also we've seen it does build momentum. If you run a one-off event, normally what I find is that Christians may come to check it out. They may, if they're kind of courageous Christians, invite some of their non-Christian friends. But normally the numbers might be quite disappointing. But if you run a series of events and they're done, as we said, in a good venue with creativity, with a good speaker and so on, what you find almost always is that the numbers grow. And that's because the first night the Christians come to see whether it's any good. If it's any good, the second night they actually bring their friends. If their friends enjoy it, which they often do, the third night the friends bring their friends, and often the best evangelists are the non-Christians, because the non-Christians haven't yet realised that evangelism is scary and that they're not meant to want to do it. And so they bring their friends and so on, and often you get kind of atheists bringing all of their housemates saying, oh, this is really interesting. And the whole thing can grow exponentially. So this was a mission in Ukraine a few years ago that we did. The first night there was one non-Christian who came and about 5 Christians. This was the last night. The room was overflowing and there weren't enough chairs because it had grown. And that normally happens. So there's a great value in organising something that is consecutive, something where there's an opportunity for momentum to build as the week goes on. Another thing that we've learned is this. We need to generate interest. Because if you ask the average student in the average European university, would you like to come to a Christian event? The chances are most of them will say no, because that's people's response to Christianity in Europe today. Christianity is something that we've moved on from. It's something in our history, maybe. It's not something that we're particularly interested in. So it's more than just inviting people to an event. We need to think about what we're inviting them to and how we can kind of intrigue people and generate interest before an event begins. Now, this is just one idea of many that I've seen, but this was brilliant. This was in, well, I first saw it in the University of Bath in the southwest of England. They created what I call the Toblerone Tower. I call it the Toblerone Tower because if you look here, it's a kind of 3-sided blackboard they put out on the university. And then they asked people different questions on each side of the board. So this was, does God exist and does it matter? And you can see there's a kind of scale, God exists, God doesn't exist, doesn't matter, does matter. And then there were pens that hung down from the side of it and people could come along and mark their response on that. This one was, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? People could just write up their thoughts on it. Is God good or bad? Is God powerful or weak? Was this graph that we asked people to fill out. And then this, obviously it's quite prominent, it's right in the heart of the university campus, people come along, and it was just brilliant because people would look at it, and firstly they would start reading other people's responses, and then without even being asked, they would start picking up the pens to write their responses, to plot their kind of perspective and so on. And it was the easiest thing to do as a Christian because you just stood by this board, you waited for people to walk to you, you didn't even have to ask them to come up. And then you would just say to them, what do you think? Or why did you put that? And you could get into conversation. Of course, once you got into conversation and people were starting to talk about their own ideas, their own beliefs, it was much easier to then invite people to an event. And of course, they were much more likely to come to the event because they'd become intrigued by what they'd heard. So trying to do stuff that doesn't just advertise, but intrigues people, that generates interest, that gets people thinking. That's been brilliant, and there are lots of other things people have done. People have done surveys and questionnaires. You might have tea and coffee stands, stalls, anything to create interest around the university. The next thing we say is we need to engage with people where they are at. Where people are, yes. What I mean by that is, as we said, most people now in Europe are not even asking kind of God questions or Christian questions. So the question is, how do we communicate and how do we connect with people who are coming from these kind of backgrounds? If you have a week, as we sometimes had in the past, Christianity Awareness Week, most people won't want to come. Or a Jesus Week, as one university called it. Well, I'm not interested in that. So we're thinking, what can we do that will kind of generate interest and create real interest in the mission? So one of the things we did is say, what are the kind of questions that people are asking today? The kind of questions people are asking today are not so much God questions, but they are still questions. So for instance, in the past, we would ask questions like, why does God allow suffering? But last year I went to do a mission week in Croatia, and we asked people this question. We asked people, does suffering disprove the existence of God? And we discovered that I think 99% of the people who were asked said no, which is kind of a great surprise, because we were expecting most people to say yes, of course, suffering disproves God. And when we asked people the follow-up question, why do you not think that suffering disproves God? The response that most people gave was simply, well, what has God got to do with suffering? Because they had no concepts of the idea of an omnipotent or all-loving God, it wasn't even a philosophical problem that there might be a difficulty with suffering and God, you see. Or, for instance, the question that we might have looked at in the past was, how can Jesus be the only way to God? Well, you go around asking people, how can Jesus be the only way to God? Most people haven't even heard that Jesus is the only way to God, or at least that Christians claim that Jesus is the only way to God. So to ask that question isn't really engaging with people. Actually, also, it's kind of negative because it potentially is putting a doubt in their mind that they don't even have. A friend of mine said it's a bit like putting up an advert for Coca-Cola that says, does Coke rot your teeth? I mean, it'd be a rubbish advert for Coca-Cola, wouldn't it, if we're just asking the negative questions. So we thought, well, how can we ask questions that people are asking? Sometimes it's a case of just rephrasing questions that we've already used. So instead of, why does God allow suffering? We ask questions like, is there any purpose in my pain? Because everybody is asking questions like that. We all look at a broken world. We want to know if there's any meaning to it. Instead of, how can Jesus be the only way? Questions like, how can we have harmony in a world of competing truth claims? Because we are very aware that we live in multicultural societies. We're very aware that there can be conflict between religions, and we want to know how we can have a harmonious society. So trying to rephrase questions so that they have more of a draw and more of an interest. And then sometimes looking at the existential desires that people have and look at how we can tap into those desires. Let me give you a few ideas. This was one mission week that I did back in February. These were the evening talks of the mission that week. And the whole week was called Known, and it was picking up on the idea that students want to be known for something, and we have that longing to be known as individuals. And so we had titles like this: Known for being real, searching for authenticity in a world of filters. Known for being somebody, searching for significance in a world of 7 billion. Known for being free, searching for fulfillment in a world of never enough. Known for being good, searching for justice in an unjust world. Known for being loved, searching for lasting love in a temporary world. And then some of the lunchtime talks that we gave were these. Do humans deserve human rights? So tapping into the idea of where our human value comes from. That was fascinating to a lot of people, because a lot of people were studying human rights, or at least had lectures on human rights as part of their course, and they'd never thought about the origin of where human rights comes from. As I said, is there meaning in my suffering? Is there more to life than just being happy? So rather than asking people's doubts about Christianity, trying to cast doubt on people's own worldview and say, hey, we all say we just want to be happy, but is there more to life than just that? Is happily ever after just wishful thinking, which was really a way into getting to looking at the idea of, is faith just a psychological crutch? But also, what's the evidence for the resurrection? What's the evidence for Christian hope? Or this one, what can I contribute to life that death won't rob? Now, when we did this mission, we handed out the flyers for the mission. And what was fascinating was that again and again, non-Christian students who had no interest in the Christian faith looked at these titles and they said, wow, that looks really interesting. I want to come. And if you think about it, the title of the talks that we're inviting people to is one of the most important things that we can actually think about when it comes to a mission event or an evangelistic event. Because it's the one way we can really show welcome and hospitality to our audience. It's the one way we can show that we really connect with where our audience is at, by seeking to try and understand the questions that they really want to have answered. There's no point in presenting the questions that we want to answer. We need to think about the questions that people are really thinking about, and then how we can bridge from that to the gospel. So that was a mission called Known. This was another mission that was called Journey. So taking the idea of journey, that we're all on a journey, and then all of the talks kind of tapped into that idea. So true happiness, why does it always seem to be around the next corner? On the road to success, how do I know I'm enough? Pressing on, is there point to my pain? Life, is death a dead end? Other missions that we've been done, one was called Human, that we did in Zurich recently, looking at the idea of what does it mean to be human, and we looked at different aspects of being human, emotional, the problem of suffering, rational, the search for evidence, relational, the search for love, eternal, the longing for something that death won't rob, and so on. And so that was another way in. So what we're trying to do is find themes and titles that will connect, that will intrigue, and that will speak to the broad population of the university campus, not just the 5% that would consider themselves spiritual or interested in religion. A few more things, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. I don't know what number this is. Find the key that will unlock a key opportunity in the university. Something we found across Europe is sometimes you can do something that will have a disproportionate impact or appeal within the university. So a few years ago, we were in Prague. We had the Foyer conference there that year. John Lennox was coming for the conference. And so we managed to get John invited to the main university in Prague to give an address to speak. Now, the original idea was that the Christian student group were going to organise it and then advertise it. But then we said, well, actually, no, wouldn't it be wiser to go to the university authorities and say, look, we've got a professor from Oxford University coming to the university. Would you like him to give a lecture? The university authorities said that was fine. They booked a room. The Christian group said, actually, no, we think you should book a bigger room. And so they said, okay. So they booked a bigger room, and they said, but we really think this is far too big. You'll never be able to fill it. Well, they did fill it. In fact, they had to turn away 300 people who couldn't get in because it was so full. And it had a massive appeal. Now, the key there was that actually the university issued the invitation, and the university did a lot of the advertising on behalf of the Christian group. And so one of the aspects of the Foyer network that we heard about earlier is a desire to get Christian academics from universities involved, because academics can open doors into opportunities that an evangelist or a primary evangelist wouldn't be able to do in the same way. And so working in conjunction, we've been able to do that. Now, the good thing about that is that this event was the first event in a whole week of mission that was going to be done. Michael Green, back then, was then the evangelist who then spoke at the events after that. But this, of course, had a wide appeal, which then fed into the more specifically evangelistic events of the week. In the Balkans, Nick Vujicic has been used quite widely in places like Serbia and Montenegro and so on. And obviously his name immediately alerts people to the fact that he is of Balkan heritage in his family backgrounds. And so he has gone on a number of speaking tours in universities and in towns around the Balkans. And these are the kind of crowds that turn out to the events organised. This was in Novi Sad. Just to give you a sense of scale, the student group in Novi Sad has about 40 students involved in it. And I think there was about 5,000 came to this event where he spoke. And so again, it had a disproportionate impact, partly because they could get someone who could open the door to a key opportunity. As a result, they were able to advertise it on national television. They got Novak Djokovic to do advertising as well as the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, and it generated interest. Now, the key again was doing that event the week before a mission meant that people who were interested from that event could then come to a series of more specifically evangelistic addresses, and so the impact wasn't lost. Sometimes we do big events, but there's no follow-up, and so the impact isn't quite as high as it could be. Other things that we've done, debates are great. Again, if you do a debate, it's wonderful if you can get it hosted by the university. So again, in Novi Sad, we had a debate, but we got it to be hosted by the Philosophical Society at the university, or the philosophical departments. And one of the non-Christian students, who was a student of philosophy, hosted the evening. Then we asked the Atheists Association of Serbia to nominate a speaker to speak on behalf of the atheist side, and then I went to speak on behalf of the Christian side. And again, because it was not seen as a specifically Christian event, it had a very broad appeal. It was absolutely packed. But of course, conveniently, we hosted it on the first night of several nights where I was going to be speaking, and it meant that people could come back. It was the biggest attended event, but a lot of people came back as a result to hear the other addresses. This is just one other thing to mention. In the UK, Christmas carol services are one of the biggest opportunities that we get each year in terms of evangelism. Because the weird thing about British students is that although they like to think that they're cool and modern and everything else, when it comes to Christmas, they all like to sing Christmas carols. And so if you invite a student in Britain to go to a carol service, they all say yes. And so this is the student group in Exeter. The student group is about 100. Well, this year it was about 100. This was their carol service in the football stadium, about 3,500 people. This was in Durham Cathedral. Again, a similar number of people packing out the whole cathedral for a student group of about 200. In fact, that's about a quarter of the actual university body in Durham. A quarter of all the students come to their carol service. And so what they found is they've just found a unique seasonal event that has a broad appeal and managed to get it advertised widely, make it become not just a Christian event, but in a sense a university-wide event, and then get people to come off the back of it. And over years, that has built. But those kind of things can have a disproportionate impact. So the thing to do is to say, what could we do in our context that would really capture people's imagination? What speaker would particularly interest people? What kind of events would people necessarily come to? And then how can we combine that maybe with some form of follow-up so that the impact is maximised? And the last thing I want to say, and then we'll go to some questions, is this, the need for perseverance. This is actually taken in the town of Novi Sad 12 years ago. You can tell it's 12 years ago because I look a lot younger and I don't have any grey hair. I went there and we talked about the idea of doing some kind of public evangelistic event or a mission week. And we chatted with the students, these are a few of them, and Slavko as well was with us. But the reaction at the time was, from some, I don't think that would really work in our city. We're not sure we'd be able to get a venue, we're not sure that people would come, and so on. And yet, wonderfully, over the next few years, that group tried to do something. Now, the next year they tried to do something. It wasn't very well attended. It wasn't a great venue. And so they tried the year after and the year after. And over the course of about 3 years, they got to a point where they were doing some fantastic events. They got a brilliant cafe right at the centre of the university. And they worked out a way of advertising it that really generated interest and so on. And it was really successful. So over the course of 4 years, they'd gone from saying, it couldn't work, it's not even worth trying, to having a go and occasionally failing, to then getting to a point where they're saying, actually, this really, really works. And we've got something that's a model that really is successful. Similarly, down in Albania, when they first tried to do some public evangelistic events a few years ago, the initial events weren't very successful. But instead of giving up, they reviewed what they did, they adapted what they did, they thought about the local context more, and now they have missions all over Albania that are having a really big impact because they've been able to be persistent in what they've done. And so my encouragement is to say, when we fail in evangelism, rather than giving up and saying, we gave it a go, it doesn't work, it's better to say, okay, why didn't it work? And how could we change things? And maybe if we change things, it will work in the future. And often the difference between success and failure when it comes to an evangelistic event or a mission is the 5%, not the 95%. Sometimes you can do lots of things really well, but there's just one thing that doesn't really work so well, and that's the bit that's kind of been the roadblock. So in Novi Sad, the challenge was just getting the right venue. And once we got the right venue, it took off. In other places, it was getting the right format and an event that would be attractive. In other places, it was getting the right kind of questions that would really connect. But the key is don't give up when something doesn't work, but just review, adapt, and persevere until you find something that does.